November 18, 1942, Buna, New Guinea. Rain hammers the canopy like steady drumfire, and the swamp below answers with a sucking, breathless sound as men step, slip, and wrench their boots free from mud that seems alive. The air is thick enough to feel in the lungs: wet heat, rotting vegetation, smoke that clings to skin. Somewhere ahead, Japanese machine guns crack in short bursts, then fall silent again, as if the jungle itself is choosing when to speak. But for the men moving forward through the Buna swamps, there is another sound that never stops: the squish of water inside their footwear, the dull rasp of soaked leather and cloth rubbing raw against skin with every step. In this kind of country, a march is not simply a march. It is a slow contest between flesh and moisture. American infantrymen, many of them new to combat, carry rifles and packs and the weight of orders they cannot ignore. They are told to keep moving, to press the attack, to close with an enemy who has dug in among coconut logs and earthworks and tangled greenery. Yet the ground under them is not ground at all. It is water and mud and black, stagnant channels. Men stumble into knee-deep pools, and when they haul themselves out, the water stays with them, trapped in socks, trapped in seams, trapped against the skin. You can almost feel it yourself, just watching them: the cold shock of sudden immersion, the brief sting, then the steady, grinding misery as wet fabric tightens and softens and starts to behave like sandpaper. There's no clean place to sit. There's no dry place to stand. The jungle doesn't offer relief, only more jungle. At the edge of a clearing that isn't really a clearing, just a thin, churned strip where foot traffic has killed the plants, a medic crouches beneath a poncho rigged as a makeshift shelter. He's working by feel as much as sight, because the light is dim under the canopy and everything is the color of damp earth. A wounded man lies on a poncho sheet, jaw clenched, not from a bullet wound but from humiliation and fear. He's been pulled out of the line because he can't walk. Boots off, the medic orders, not as drama, not as outrage, but as routine. The laces are stiff with mud. Fingers struggle. When the boot finally peels away, it comes off with a sound like tearing cloth from glue. The smell hits first: sour, fungal, something sweet and rotten underneath, the odor of skin that has been wet too long. The sock is gray-brown with swamp water. When it slides down, it reveals flesh that no longer looks like flesh. The foot is pale and wrinkled in places, blistered in others, and around the toes the skin is breaking down, softened until it splits. Small abrasions, nothing anyone would have noticed back on a parade field, have become open doors. In the tropics, an open door invites everything. This is not trench foot in the strict sense of a European winter, though the mechanism of damage from prolonged wet exposure can be hauntingly similar. Here, in the New Guinea heat, the problem is immersion and maceration and fungus, and then infection, bacteria taking advantage of tissue weakened by constant moisture. It is tropical ulcer, for some, a raw wound that refuses to close. For others it becomes a spreading redness, swelling, fever, conditions that can climb up the leg if not checked, turning a soldier into a patient and a rifleman into a stretcher burden. The medic applies powder where he can. He cleans what he can. He wraps what he can. But you can see it in the way his shoulders sag. He knows wraps are not a miracle in a swamp. He knows the battlefield is still wet outside the poncho shelter. He knows the man will either be evacuated, if evacuation is possible, or sent back toward the line to suffer again. Nearby, other men sit with their backs against trees, boots loosened, socks hanging over branches in a futile attempt to dry an air that is already saturated. They slap at mosquitoes. They stare at their own feet with a kind of disbelief. They expected bullets. They expected explosions. They did not expect that their bodies would start to fail from the ground up. The problem is not courage. The problem is contact. Contact between skin and water and friction and time. The United States Army did not enter the Pacific with tropical warfare as its oldest habit. The Army had experience in many climates, but the early months of the Pacific War slammed units into environments that punished assumptions. Footwear that held up on training fields and ship decks and dry roads could become an instrument of injury in jungle mud. Leather can trap moisture. Stitching can hold water. A boot built to protect against rough terrain can, in constant saturation, become a sealed chamber that never truly dries. And the Japanese defenders of places like Buna, veterans of their own hard campaigning, watch these struggles from the shadowed edges of their positions. They understand the jungle's cruelty. They have been living inside it. Some Japanese troops fight in standard-issue footwear, some improvise, some wear split-toe shoes or boots depending on unit and supply. They, too, suffer from disease, malnutrition, fungal infections, and wounds that fester. Yet in late 1942, Japanese defenses in New Guinea are often built on the assumption that time is on their side, that the Allies must cross swamps and rivers and heat and sickness just to reach the fight. The jungle is not merely terrain. It is an ally that attacks without needing ammunition. And so, when early American attempts at specialized tropical footwear begin to appear, experimental patterns, canvas and rubber concepts, designs meant to dry faster or drain better, the reaction from the other side, when it is noticed at all, is not panic. It is dismissal. There is no single document that captures a universal Japanese opinion. Armies are not one mind, and sources vary in what they record. But the broader attitude is easy to understand. The Japanese have watched foreigners struggle in tropical environments for decades, and they have watched early American forces arrive with gear still tuned for other climates. If a new American boot looks odd, lighter, stranger, with materials that seem too thin, some will naturally assume it is a gimmick. Something that won't survive. Something that will fall apart in jungle mud. After all, the jungle has a reputation for laughing last. But the Buna campaign doesn't care about reputation. It cares about wetness and friction and hours on your feet. A sergeant pushes his men forward along a narrow track of smashed greenery. The sounds of the swamp swallow footsteps. A rifle cracks. Somewhere to the front, a man yells and then cuts off. The sergeant looks back for a moment and sees one of his soldiers limping. Not wounded by fire, just limping, as if each step has become a personal negotiation with pain. This is how combat power drains away in the tropics. Not all at once, not in a cinematic burst, but in quiet increments. One man falls out. Then another. Then a dozen. The unit still exists on paper, still holds rifles, still obeys orders, but its legs are failing. Its pace slows. Its endurance collapses. And the enemy, dug in and watching, doesn't need to guess what's happening. The jungle writes it plainly across the march. Far from Buna, far from the mud and the blood and the smell of infection, reports begin to move. They move the way wartime information moves, through medical officers who count cases, through commanders who complain about non-battle casualties, through supply channels that try to turn suffering into requisitions and specifications. Numbers are written down. Patterns are noted. Terms like immersion, fungus, ulcer, and evacuation appear again and again. Somewhere in the machinery of the army, among quartermasters, doctors, logisticians, an uncomfortable realization takes shape. A soldier who cannot walk is a soldier who cannot fight. And if the tropics are going to be a major theater of war, then the army is going to have to fight the jungle with something more than bullets. Because out here, in the Buna swamps, the enemy is not only the Japanese soldier behind the log barricade. The enemy is also the wet boot that never dries, and the foot that begins to rot inside it, quietly, relentlessly, until a fighting man becomes another casualty of the climate. And the war, indifferent and hungry, keeps demanding that the next man step forward into the mud. And so, while the war kept demanding the next man step forward into the mud, a quieter war began behind the lines, measured in sick call lists, requisition forms, and the hard arithmetic of how many soldiers could still march. In New Guinea, the fighting did not pause for paperwork. But paperwork followed the fighting like a shadow. At Port Moresby, And in other forward hubs scattered across the Southwest Pacific, medical officers and supply men worked under canvas and corrugated metal, surrounded by crates and mosquitoes and the constant rumble of aircraft. Lamps burned at odd hours. Maps were pinned to walls already warped by humidity. The air smelled of fuel, sweat, and mildew. In the margins of operation orders, beside the enemy situation and the supply estimates, another problem kept appearing. Men who were neither killed nor wounded by fire, yet still removed from the line. Feet. A company could take a ridge and still lose men afterward, lost not to enemy bullets but to the aftermath of wet exposure and infection. The tropics turned minor injuries into disabling ones. Skin softened, split, and invited fungus. Fungus invited deeper infection. Infection invited evacuation. The frontline medic could powder and wrap and warn, but when the next day's movement began, the jungle undid yesterday's care in a single mile. For commanders trying to hold momentum, it was maddening. For doctors trying to preserve fighting strength, it was a grim pattern. And for the quartermaster system, responsible for clothing and equipment, it was a direct challenge. The issue was not merely what men carried, but whether the most basic item on a soldier's body could survive the climate at all. The Pacific made everything a supply problem. The distances alone were punishing. Thousands of miles of ocean separating factories and depots from muddy trails and coral beaches. Moving supplies from the American West Coast to staging points like Brisbane could take months, and then everything still had to be pushed forward again through a chain of ports, airfields, beaches, and roads that were often little more than hack tracks. Quartermaster Foundation. That reality shaped the conversation about boots. If a new design was needed, it had to be produced at scale, shipped across the world, and delivered intact to men who might already be fighting barefoot in spirit if not in fact. Back in the United States, the Army had been thinking about tropical footwear even before the headlines of Buna and Guadalcanal. Small test issues in places like Panama explored the uncomfortable truth that no boot could keep water out and still keep a foot healthy in swamp conditions. The logic was blunt. In the tropics, water would get in rain, sweat, river crossings, mud. The only question was what happened next. Did the boot trap that moisture until the skin broke down? Or did it let the water drain and the foot breathe? Out of that thinking came early jungle or hot weather boot concepts that looked strange compared to standard field shoes, lighter materials, rubber soles, and canvas uppers that could dry faster than thick leather. Some versions incorporated drainage eyelets, screened openings intended to let water escape without inviting in every insect and pebble in the jungle. And inside, there was a particularly telling innovation, an attempt to solve the problem at the point of contact between skin and boot, ventilating insoles made from layered plastic mesh, intended to circulate air as a man walked, helping moisture move away from the foot rather than turning the boot into a damp vault. In 1942, versions of these ideas were adopted and pushed into the war zone as the need became undeniable, and they began to show up, unevenly, among U.S. forces operating in the very environments that were destroying ordinary footwear. Yet, adoption on paper was not the same as transformation in the field. If you were an infantryman in the Southwest Pacific, you might hear rumors that better boots existed somewhere, boots that drained, boots that dried, boots that might keep your skin from turning pale and dead under constant wetness. But rumors didn't arrive by landing craft. Rumors didn't arrive by mule train. And even when a new item did reach a depot, it had to fight its own war, against shipping priorities, against shortages, against the simple fact that ammunition and food always came first. So in many units, the old reality persisted, leather and stitching and soaked socks, day after day. The most disciplined soldiers tried to make routines out of desperation, drying socks over smoky fires, swapping pairs when they could, rubbing feet with powder, airing boots whenever the rain stopped long enough to pretend the air had changed. The Army's medical services emphasized preventive measures and field hygiene because tropical disease and skin conditions were constant threats. National Museum of the Pacific War. And still, casualties mounted, casualties that didn't look dramatic in photographs. A man could stand upright and still be lost, because the pain in his feet made every step a wound reopening. The Army's medical authorities would later describe immersion-type injuries and tropical environments that encouraged disabling skin disease, including serious foot problems among troops moving through rivers and mud. The language might be clinical, but the reality in 1942 and 1943 was anything but. The jungle was stripping away the body's protection layer by layer. On the Japanese side, the jungle was no gentler. Japanese troops also struggled with disease, malnutrition, and infections, especially as supply lines tightened and positions became isolated. But in those early campaigns, Japanese defenses often relied on the assumption that time and terrain would weaken the attacker. If American soldiers looked burdened and slow in the swamps, it was easy to believe the environment would do its work. And when new American tropical footwear appeared, unfamiliar, lighter, different, some on the defending side reportedly viewed it as flimsy or odd rather than revolutionary. The jungle had humbled too many armies for anyone to assume a single piece of gear could change its verdict. The specifics of individual reactions are difficult to document consistently. Sources rarely preserve such moment-by-moment impressions in a way that can be verified across the board. Wikipedia. But war is not decided by what looks impressive at a glance. It is decided by what keeps a man moving on the 5th day, the 10th day, the 20th day, when the body is already exhausted and the ground is still wet. That was the true test awaiting the new boot designs. Not a parade. Not a factory inspection. A march through swamp water, then another and another, until the skin either broke down as before or held long enough for a unit to keep fighting. And now, as shipments crept forward across the Pacific's vast distances, as quartermaster depots sorted and resorted priorities, as medics watched men collapse from problems that began between a sock and a sole, the question sharpened into something as urgent as any operation order. Would the Army's answer arrive in time, before the jungle took more soldiers out of the war than the enemy ever could? The answer did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way most things arrived in the Pacific, in crates. Somewhere along a wet shoreline, at a forward depot that might be nothing more than stacked boxes under camouflage netting, a supply sergeant pried open a lid with a bayonet and a curse. The wood was swollen from salt air. Nails resisted. When the crate finally gave, the smell that rose from inside was not jungle rot or sweat, but fresh rubber and treated canvas, clean, factory-made, almost out of place in a world where everything else mildewed. Boots. Not the thick leather footwear many men had started the war with, but lighter tropical designs. Rubber soles meant for slick ground, uppers that would not drink water the same way leather did, and, most importantly, small screened openings set low on the sides so water could escape instead of pooling around the foot. Some versions included a ventilating insole concept meant to keep air moving under the sole as a man walked, a quiet engineering idea that sounded almost too gentle for a war zone. And still in that moment, those boots were not equipment. They were a promise. On paper, their purpose was plain, except that water would get in, then get it out again. In practice, the difference could only be measured by what didn't happen afterward, by infections that never took hold, by men who didn't show up at sick call with feet so broken down they could no longer march. But distribution in the Pacific was never uniform. One unit might receive the new boots early, another might wait months. A company pushing through river country could be told the new issue was on the way, while the supply chain wrestled with shipping space, unloading delays, and the relentless fact that ammunition, rations, and medical supplies competed for every cubic foot of cargo. So the transformation, when it came in patches, like sunlight through jungle leaves. In one battalion, men might lace up the new boots while their neighbors still wrapped blisters in soaked bandages and prayed for a dry night that never arrived. When the first pairs reached the line, reactions were mixed. Some soldiers treated them with suspicion. They looked different, and in war, different often meant untested. A boot that seemed lighter could be dismissed as fragile. A boot that drained water could be accused of letting the jungle inside. A few men, already hardened by weeks of wet misery, didn't need convincing. They held the boot in their hands like a tool they had waited too long to see, running fingers over the eyelets, the stitching, the shape of the sole. And then came the first march. Not the short, clean movement of training, but the long, punishing trudge through heat and mud and sudden immersion, over ground that turned to soup, across streams that had no bridges, through rain that felt endless. Within hours, the test began doing what it was built to do. Water entered, yes, but it also left. The boot did not become a sealed swamp. It became something closer to a compromise with nature, a system that failed less catastrophically than the old one. For the men wearing them, the change was not a dramatic miracle. It was a gradual realization that their feet felt less like they were dissolving. And you can imagine the moment it hits them, somewhere on a trail with the jungle pressing in on both sides, when they stop for a brief rest, unlace their boots, and for the first time in days the sock is wet but not slimy, the skin tender but not breaking open in new places. It is not comfort. It is survival. Yet the army learned quickly that no boot could win this war alone. The Pacific punished not only equipment, but habits. Even the best-designed tropical footwear could be defeated by neglect. So alongside improved boots came stricter routines, pushed hard by medical officers who understood that foot casualties were combat casualties. In forward areas, you might see it at dusk, a line of exhausted men standing by a dim lantern while a platoon leader or medic made them lift a foot, then the other. Quick inspections. Blisters found early. Fungal infections treated before they spread. Socks changed whenever possible, sometimes traded like gold among men who understood that a dry pair could mean staying in the fight. Foot powder became more than a convenience. It became doctrine in practice, a small white cloud in the air as men shook it into socks and boots, trying to create a barrier between skin and moisture. Boots were loosened whenever the tactical situation allowed. Feet were aired even if only for minutes. The discipline was not glamorous, but it had a measurable effect. Fewer men collapsing into the rear, fewer riflemen turning into patients. The medical officers tracked these changes the way they tracked wounds and fevers. They could see patterns. The units with better supply and better routine maintained endurance longer. The units without them bled strength away in silence. On Japanese-held ground, the difference became visible in a way the defenders could not ignore. The jungle had always been expected to grind the attacker down. That expectation was built into defensive thinking. Let the enemy slog through swamps and heat, let disease and exhaustion do their work, then strike from prepared positions. In places like New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, time itself could feel like part of the defense. But as months passed and American logistics improved, the jungle's advantage began to narrow. Men who should have been limping were still moving. Patrols that should have stalled kept pressing. Units recovered faster after wet marches. A defender watching through foliage might still see Americans suffering, because everyone suffered in the tropics, but he might also see something unsettling, the attacker not breaking as quickly as before. It would be wrong to pretend the Japanese were immune to the same misery. Their own troops fought in the same rain, the same mud, and often with supply lines that grew thinner as the war turned against them. Foot infections, tropical ulcers, fungus, and general debilitation were not an American monopoly. They were the jungle's universal tax. What changed was who could pay it. The United States had ships, factories, and a supply network that, once it adapted, could push improvements forward in volume. It could pair equipment changes with medical guidance and then, crucially, keep replenishing what wore out. Tropical boots did not last forever. In harsh conditions, they could wear quickly. But replacement was possible in a way that it increasingly wasn't for isolated Japanese garrisons. So the war moved on, island by island, coast by coast, through campaigns where the ground was often wet and the air often heavy, and the true contest was endurance as much as firepower. And in that long movement, the small changes mattered. Boots that drained. Socks that arrived on time. powder that wasn't forgotten in a warehouse. Inspections enforced by tired officers who understood that a man's feet were part of his weapon. By the time the next major pushes gathered, toward larger landings, toward deeper advances, the Pacific had already taught its lesson in bloodless casualties. An army that cannot walk cannot win. Ahead, new operations waited, bigger beaches, longer supply lines, and terrain that would test every promise the Quartermaster crates carried with them. And the jungle, patient as ever, waited too, ready to see whether these improvements would hold when the marching started again. The jungle, patient as ever, waited too, ready to see whether these improvements would hold when the marching started again. In the months that followed, the Pacific offered no mercy and no straight lines. The fighting shifted across islands and coasts where the weather seemed to conspire with terrain. Sudden downpours that turned trails into streams, rivers that rose overnight, coral flats that scraped sols, and mangrove swamps that swallowed men to the thigh. Each new operation came with its own brutal equation. How far a unit had to move, how long it would be wet, how quickly it could be resupplied, and how many men would still be standing when the shooting began. And by 1944, in an American army that had learned the tropics the hard way, feet were no longer treated as an afterthought. Not everywhere. Not perfectly. War rarely grants perfection. But the lesson had been burned in early campaigns. A rifleman who cannot march becomes a burden. A unit that cannot move loses initiative, and in an environment where the enemy is dug in and time is precious, endurance becomes a form of firepower. So, at staging areas and forward camps, the routine hardened into policy. You can picture it on a rain-darkened afternoon, an infantry company under ponchos, rifles stacked, helmets beaded with water. The men are exhausted from movement, faces smeared with grime and insect repellent, eyes narrowed against mosquitoes. Yet before they eat, before they sleep, they are made to deal with their feet. Boots off. Socks out. Dry what can be dried. Powder what can be powdered. Blisters opened and treated before they swell into infections. Fungal rashes scraped and medicated before they become open sores. There is no romance in it. There is only the quiet logic of survival. And the boots, those strange, draining designs that once looked flimsy to some, become part of that logic. In the tropics, they are not a comfort item. They are a piece of combat engineering built around a blunt acceptance. The soldier will get wet. The goal is not to keep the foot untouched by water, but to keep it from dissolving inside a soaked enclosure. When the system works, when the right boots arrive in the right quantity, when socks are available, when medical guidance is enforced, something subtle but decisive happens. The army keeps moving. The effect is clearest when you think in terms of distance and time. Marches that would have crippled a unit early in the war become merely miserable later. Men still suffer. Men still blister. The jungle still eats at the body. But fewer are lost to the slow ruin of constant moisture. Fewer are evacuated for infections that began as small abrasions. And when the next assault is ordered, more rifles are present in the line than would have been there 2 years earlier. This is how logistics changes the shape of combat, quietly without a headline. On the Japanese side, the story bends in the opposite direction as the war progresses. Early in the conflict, Japanese forces often fought with experienced cadres and strong momentum, able to choose positions and force the attacker into punishing ground. But as American sea and air power tightened the net around island garrisons, Japanese supply lines thinned. Food grew scarce. Medicine became scarce. Replacement footwear, already difficult to transport, became rarer still. Men marched in worn boots, improvised sandals, or whatever could be salvaged. In the same wet heat that punished everyone, shortages made the punishment longer and more disabling. And this is where the title's truth lives, not in a single moment of mockery or a single dramatic reversal, but in a widening gap over time. In earlier campaigns, it was easier for Japanese defenders to believe the jungle would do half their work. They had seen attackers bogged down. They had seen men weakened by disease and exhaustion. They had watched foreigners bleed endurance onto the trails. But by late war, American forces, while still paying the jungle's price, were paying it with a stronger currency, supply. More socks, more replacement boots, better medical organization, better evacuation routes. A culture that understood prevention was not softness, but strength. The same environmental stress that once disabled large numbers of attackers began to disable proportionally fewer. And when an army stops losing men to its own footwear, it gains something the enemy cannot easily counter with bullets: sustained momentum. If you could stand unseen at the edge of a jungle track and watch an American column pass in 1944 or 1945, you would still see suffering. Shoulders hunched, packs heavy, faces drawn. But you would also see fewer men limping at the rear like wounded animals. Fewer men stopping every few minutes to wrench a boot loose from suction mud. Fewer men with that vacant, terrified look of someone who knows his own body is failing him from the ground up. The boots do not win battles alone. They never did. Battles are won by planning, firepower, leadership, courage, and, often, terrible sacrifice. But boots help decide whether the men who must do those things can still walk to the battlefield. That truth echoes beyond the Pacific campaigns themselves. The U.S. Army, like other modern militaries, absorbs lessons by institutional memory, by manuals revised, equipment redesigned, training adjusted. The tropical war forces planners to treat climate as an enemy and supply as a weapon. It proves that non-battle casualties are not a footnote, they can shape entire operations. It forces leaders to account for the human body the same way they account for fuel consumption or ammunition expenditure. And long after the fighting ends, the idea remains. In certain environments, the smallest interface between man and terrain, the sole, the sock, the skin, can decide how long an army endures. The Pacific War is remembered for carriers and island landings, for fierce defensive lines and brutal close combat. But beneath those dramatic scenes ran a quieter struggle that never made the front page maps. The struggle to keep men from being consumed by moisture, fungus, and infection before they ever reached the enemy. In the end, the transformation is not a single invention. It is a system finally doing its job: field medicine, supply discipline, equipment design, and the stubborn insistence that prevention matters even when shells are falling. And if there is a final image to hold on to, it is not a parade of polished boots. It is a night in the jungle, rain tapping on ponchos, a line of weary soldiers checking their feet by dim light because they have learned, through pain, through hard experience, that the war in the Pacific can begin at the ankle. They do it not because it is comfortable, but because it keeps them alive and moving. Somewhere beyond the trees, an enemy position waits. Somewhere behind them, the supply line strains forward. And between those two forces, between attack and defense, there is a simple, decisive fact. An army that can still walk can still fight. That simple fact followed American planners and medical officers forward as the Pacific War rolled into its later phases, into larger landings, longer advances, and battles where the environment remained as hostile as any dug-in defender. The jungle did not become kinder. The rain did not negotiate. The mud did not thin out of respect for courage. If anything, the Pacific kept proving a cruel rule. The farther an army moved from dependable ports and paved roads, the more it depended on the small, unglamorous things that kept bodies functioning. And among those things, feet were everything. By the time American forces were pushing through late war campaigns, the improvement was not simply a new boot. It was a change in the way the war was organized at the human level. Boot design mattered: drainage, materials that handled wet conditions better than thick leather, soles that gripped in slime and on slick roots. But just as important were the habits enforced around those boots: sock changes when possible, powder and ointment, inspections that caught problems early, and a supply system that learned, sometimes painfully, that a shortage of socks could produce the same operational effect as a shortage of ammunition. You can see the difference most clearly when the camera pulls back from the firefight and watches the days between battles. In the early war, a unit might survive contact and still lose dozens of men afterward to infections, ulcers, and immersion injuries, men who did not look like heroes in the dispatches but whose absence weakened the unit all the same. In the later war, those losses did not disappear, but they could be reduced. Men stayed on the line longer. Units kept their pace. The attackers' endurance stopped collapsing at the same predictable rate. That endurance did not come free. It was bought by ships and factories, by quartermaster planning, by medics enforcing routines even when everyone was exhausted, and by soldiers themselves taking the time to do something that felt almost absurd in a combat zone, caring for their feet as if it were part of their mission. And in the Pacific, it was. Because the jungle had its own strategy. It didn't need to kill you outright. It only needed to slow you down. To make each step painful enough that you began to dread movement. To turn a march into a crippling ordeal. To take a man who could fire a rifle and turn him into a man who couldn't stand. When the U.S. system began to counter that strategy, when men stopped losing feet to rot in the same numbers, when infections were checked earlier, when the supply chain actually delivered what the climate demanded, something shifted. The jungle's silent advantage shrank. The defender could still hide, still ambush, still punish the advance. But the environment was no longer guaranteed to cripple the attacker on schedule. For Japanese troops, especially those trapped on islands or cut off from reliable supply, the late war environment became even more unforgiving. As shortages worsened, the tropics punished them with the same diseases and infections, often with fewer medicines, fewer clean bandages, fewer replacements of any kind. The jungle remained impartial, but war made it unequal. One side could adapt and resupply, the other increasingly could not. This is where the title's meaning lands, not as a single recorded moment of laughter that can be pinned down like a photograph, but as a broader, lived reality. At first, improved American tropical footwear could look strange, lighter, different, less solid than old patterns. In a jungle that shredded equipment and men alike, skepticism made sense. But the real verdict wasn't decided by how a boot looked in someone's hand. It was decided by what happened after 10 days in wet country. When American troops could keep moving, when fewer men were lost to the slow breakdown of skin and tissue, the strategic consequence was enormous. An army that stays mobile can choose when to fight. It can exploit weakness. It can press an advantage instead of pausing to rebuild from invisible losses. It can keep the initiative, and in war, initiative is often the difference between victory and stalemate. Even after the Pacific War ended, the lesson remained. Modern militaries would continue to refine hot weather footwear and preventive medicine not because it made war comfortable, but because it kept forces operational in climates that are otherwise designed to break the human body. The Pacific had proven again and again that logistics is not a backdrop to combat. It is combat power expressed in mundane forms: socks, powders, drainage holes, replacement soles, and supply routes that keep those items flowing. And for the men who endured those campaigns, the memory of that wet, relentless struggle didn't always come back as a single dramatic battle. Sometimes it returned as the sensation of pulling off a boot and seeing what the jungle had done, or later, realizing what it hadn't done this time. Because not happening was the victory. No infection spreading up the leg. No ulcer opening into raw tissue. No man being carried away because his body failed at the point where it met the ground. Those quiet absences, those non-events, meant more rifles in the line, more men able to answer the next order, more endurance when the terrain tried to take it away. So when the Pacific is remembered in sweeping images, carriers at sea, landings under fire, artillery flashes in the dark, there is another image worth holding on to, smaller and closer to the human scale. A soldier in a rain-soaked camp, boots loosened, socks changed, feet powdered, taking care of the one thing the jungle wants to destroy first. Around him, the war goes on. Planes overhead, distant gunfire, the steady, suffocating breath of the tropics. And yet, in that small act of maintenance, the larger machine of victory is being fed. Because in the Pacific, staying on your feet wasn't a comfort. It was survival,